On a cold December morning in 2010, a police officer walked through thick brush along a lonely stretch of Long Island's Ocean Parkway. The search wasn't for a murder victim, it was for a missing woman. Instead, investigators made a discovery that would shock the nation. One set of human remains. Then another. And another. Within days, 4 bodies had been uncovered, all hidden within a short distance of one another. As investigators expanded the search, even more remains emerged from the marshland, turning Gilgo Beach into one of America's most haunting crime scenes. For more than a decade, families searched for answers while detectives chased a killer who seemed to vanish without a trace. Then, in July 2023, everything changed. A New York architect named Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his office in Manhattan. Authorities alleged they had finally identified the man responsible for several of the murders. But the investigation wasn't over. As evidence continued to emerge, prosecutors filed additional charges, transforming one of America's oldest unsolved serial homicide investigations into one of its biggest ongoing criminal cases. This is the story of the Gilgo Beach serial killings. Gilgo Beach sits along the southern shoreline of Long Island, New York. It's beautiful by day. But after dark, Ocean Parkway becomes isolated for miles, with marshland on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other. That isolation would eventually make it one of the most infamous locations in American criminal history. The women connected to the investigation came from different backgrounds, but many shared difficult circumstances. Several worked as escorts and advertised services online. Their families described them as daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends, not simply as victims. Among the first 4 women whose remains were discovered in December 2010 were Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Investigators later referred to them collectively as the Gilgo 4. Each woman had disappeared years earlier after arranging meetings with clients. Their disappearances initially appeared unrelated. No one realized they were connected until the discoveries at Gilgo Beach. The investigation expanded dramatically in 2011. Search teams uncovered additional remains belonging to other victims nearby. Some remains had been at the location for years. Others predated the Gilgo 4. Investigators faced a difficult question. Were all these victims connected to one killer? Or had multiple offenders used the same remote area? For years, no definitive answer emerged. Much about the crimes remains unknown. Authorities alleged that several victims communicated with the suspect through disposable burner phones before disappearing. Investigators later stated that these devices were used briefly and then discarded, making the trail difficult to follow. According to prosecutors, the alleged offender carefully selected meeting locations and took extensive steps to avoid detection. The victims vanished without immediate witnesses. Some families spent years searching. Others waited by telephones, hoping for news that never came. In one of the most widely discussed elements of the investigation, prosecutors alleged that after Melissa Barthelemy disappeared, a series of phone calls were made to her family using her cell phone. Authorities have alleged that these calls were brief and taunting, adding another layer of trauma for those left behind. The remains of several victims were eventually discovered, wrapped in burlap, hidden in dense vegetation near Ocean Parkway. The secluded location delayed discovery for years. With every new search, investigators uncovered additional evidence, deepening the mystery rather than solving it. The Gilgo Beach investigation quickly became one of the largest homicide investigations in New York history. Thousands of leads poured in. Investigators interviewed witnesses. They reviewed thousands of phone records. Years passed. Despite enormous effort, the case stalled. Leadership changes within law enforcement and renewed investigative strategies eventually breathed new life into the investigation. A multi-agency task force was formed. Rather than treating old evidence as exhausted, investigators revisited every detail. One breakthrough involved cell phone records. Authorities alleged that burner phones used to contact victims were analyzed alongside broader communications data. According to prosecutors, investigators identified patterns that pointed toward Midtown Manhattan, where Rex Heuermann worked. Vehicle evidence also became significant. A witness had previously described a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. Investigators determined that Heuermann owned a vehicle matching that description during the relevant period. The task force continued quietly gathering evidence, rather than making an immediate arrest. Investigators conducted months of surveillance. According to court filings, they recovered discarded items believed to contain DNA. Laboratory analysis allegedly linked the DNA to evidence recovered during the investigation. Hair evidence also became central. Prosecutors alleged that hairs recovered from several victims were consistent with DNA associated with members of Heuermann's household. Authorities emphasized that these findings are part of the prosecution's evidence, while the defense has challenged aspects of the forensic analysis. On July 13, 2023, investigators arrested Rex Heuermann in Manhattan. The following day, prosecutors announced charges related to multiple murders. As the investigation continued, additional indictments followed involving other victims. Search warrants executed at his residence resulted in the seizure of computers, electronic devices, documents, firearms, and thousands of items investigators considered potentially relevant. Digital forensic examinations reportedly took months. Investigators also examined architectural records, internet activity, and travel history as they continued building the case. Rex Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. As of this video's production, the criminal proceedings remain ongoing, because the case has not reached a final verdict. The allegations presented by prosecutors have yet to be tested fully in court. The Gilgo Beach investigation has profoundly affected the families of the victims. For many, the arrest represented the first significant development after years of uncertainty. Still, answers remain incomplete. Questions persist about whether all the Gilgo Beach victims are connected, whether additional offenders were involved, and whether other unsolved disappearances might be related. Investigators have continued reviewing cold cases throughout Long Island and neighboring jurisdictions. The investigation has also prompted discussions about how crimes involving marginalized victims are investigated. Advocates argue that disappearances involving sex workers historically received less public attention, potentially delaying investigative momentum. Law enforcement agencies have since highlighted changes in forensic technology, digital evidence analysis, and interagency cooperation as key factors in advancing cold cases. For years, Gilgo Beach was known primarily for its quiet coastline. Today, its name is forever linked to one of America's most complex homicide investigations. The story is not simply about a suspect. It is about families who refuse to stop searching, detectives who return to evidence many believed had gone cold, advances in forensic science that transformed forgotten clues into new investigative leads, and victims whose names deserve to be remembered beyond headlines. As the legal process continues, the courts, not public opinion, will determine guilt or innocence based on the evidence presented. Whatever the final outcome, the Gilgo Beach investigation stands as a reminder that even cases left unsolved for years can change dramatically when technology, persistence, and careful investigative work converge. Sometimes the smallest clue remains silent for years, until it finally speaks.